I'm John Graft, and I love Chicago real estate. Between showings, I stop in my favorite places, talk with local business owners, and bring their story to you. This is my Chicago.
With everybody in this building, you'll support it.
And that's going to be interesting too, because there's like a smoothie shop and a gym going in this building, or like one of these buildings on the Wells side, so number 2. And I don't think they've leased number 1 yet, but there's a lot of things that would do really well here. A hot sauna place would do, or not hot sauna, a hot yoga place I think would kill it. Right. And I also think a pizza
I'm
place
surprised
where
like
you just
a
sell
Core
slices.
Power wouldn't open up here.
Yeah, that would do well too.
Yeah. Oh, pizza slices.
Yeah. There's
That's
no good
interesting.
pizza slice place around here.
Yeah.
And if they had that and they could be open late, they would crush.
Well, there's that place. There's a place on Division where the bars are,
Yeah.
kind of across the street from Mother's, that sells slices.
That place is so gross.
It's funny you say
It's
that.
the worst pizza.
It's funny you say that. I lived in Newbury 20 years ago, and I would frequent that place. And then a year or two later, it got shut down by the city for a prolonged period of time because of rat droppings on the pizzas. And I haven't gone back.
Yeah.
But it's back open. You know,
I've never had
that's
worse
the
pizza in
closest
Chicago.
slice that I can think of, because I like pizza and I like a slice. I guess a Blaze would probably do okay.
Yeah.
On the strip here. But
You need something less. Commercial
But
would be successful here, but I would hate to see a commercial place come in. There's too much. This block is it's too commercial on Wells.
Well, it's funny, you know, when I was growing up, North and Wells was the hip area. Division and Wells was no man land. Now Division and Wells is cooler than North and Wells.
Yeah, and
Even though I do like Foxtrot. But they're opening up a new Foxtrot over by the health food store down the block from Gibson's, down the block from Maple
over
and
there.
Ash.
Oh yeah, on the east side of the street.
On the south
Right?
side of the
On
street.
the south side of the street.
Yeah, because that Maple runs east and west.
And Maple and Ash. Oh wait, where?
Okay, so you know where there's an Ace Hardware on Maple?
Yeah.
Directly across the street, there's a building.
Oh, that's an interesting location. I don't even think. What's there now?
Nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
It's a building that's been sitting there vacant for 4 years since it was built.
Okay.
Maybe by Jimmy Leschinger or somebody.
Yeah.
But it's been sitting there, maybe it's been sitting there for 5 years.
Yeah.
Brand new, vacant. When you go by it next time, you'll
Yeah,
say,
I'll spot
oh,
it now.
Yeah.
You know, it's
But it's going to be a big hangout, I predict.
well, Foxtrot's done so well.
It has done so well. And that corner bakery used to be over there and it closed, kind of next to Goddess and the Grocer on State.
Okay.
But I don't know if you remember that.
People like hip type places, and Foxtrot really knew what they were doing.
Yep,
And really did it
absolutely.
right.
They just raised a bunch of money.
Yeah, I saw
They
that.
raised $40 million, so they're gonna
I know they're scaling. They're going to
try to
Austin.
open 50 of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan.
I think I know someone. That's working with them to scale, who worked at Shopify and is now working for them to do it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's what they do. And he was paid in shares. I mean, along with other things, but it's a good business. That's really the appeal of working for a startup. You get all these shares.
Yeah.
Once they vest,
Yeah,
you're like,
I'd
okay.
say.
How'd you get into this business?
Into the auction business?
In the real estate.
Oh, mine was a really interesting, bizarre journey. When I was in my young 20s, I got my real estate license actually at college at the University of Illinois. And then I came up to Chicago and I did a couple different careers in my young 20s. But my sister had an antique store in Highland Park.
Okay.
And I met a man who had the largest antique store in Chicago at 3020 North Lincoln Avenue.
Okay.
Called the Antique Palace. And I was trying to sell some kind of like vintage antique couches made of the back ends of 57 Chevys. But they were a lot of money, like $10,000 30 years ago. Yeah.
Wow, okay.
So I remembered this big antique store in Chicago, and I went in and I talked to the owner, and he took a liking to me, and he was wealthy, a little eccentric, and he said, listen, I own 10 buildings around Lincoln Park and the Loop, and I'm buying the Hammond Organ Factory at 2929 Northwestern Avenue in Chicago. Do you want to come in and manage my buildings and open up an antique mart with me? And one of the careers I had already had in my young 20s, I had already been a property manager for apartment buildings and shopping centers. So I knew that industry.
Okay.
I wasn't a big fan of it, Because if you're doing your job, people just say you're doing your job, but if something goes wrong, a roof's leaking or something, it's your fault, you know. And
Property management is the most thankless job there is.
It is thankless. So I had that experience. So anyway, so I said okay, and I started managing his 10 buildings, but more importantly, he bought this Hammond organ factory, 100,000 square foot building, and in about 3 months, I found 65 antique dealers, because I had grown up with a sister owning an antique store in the suburbs. I found 65 antique dealers to rent little spaces in this big industrial building on Western and Belmont, a block from Western and Belmont, including the governor of Illinois, who was leaving office at the time, Jim Thompson, who the Thompson Center is named after. I got him and his partner, along with the guy I was working for, we got him to rent an antique store on the ground floor of the building. So then we were in the antique business, and there was a big empty room, and I said, well, what should we do with this room? And he said, well, let's do auctions. And he said, well, I said, well, who's going to do the auctions? And he said, you are. And I said, I am. I mean, I had seen auctions in movies and TV shows. So I said, where am I going to get stuff to auction? And he said, well, go to the 65 people you just rented spaces to. Many of them were doctors, lawyers, and accountants who...
Really?
Yeah, on the side, they were in the antique business. That was their hobby or their passion. And we would...
I would never guess that.
We would run their booths for them when they were working. And sometimes they'd come in on the weekends and they would stand in their own booths.
When I go to Lake Geneva, Galena, or one of those places, you always see one of those setups.
Yes, right. And so we would take a commission, we would rent them space. The rental rate is very attractive, because for a 10-foot by 8-foot space, if you can get 50, 60, 70, 80, $100 a foot. But then there has to be walkways and other things for the antique mart. And then we would charge a commission to sell their stuff, or they could come in their booth and sell their own stuff. Well, anyway, so I asked all of them if they had anything that they wanted to sell, and they all said, yeah, here, take this, take that. So we started doing auctions in this big room, and sure enough, I was running it. So I'm thrust into the personal property auction business. And then I read in the newspaper in 1991, I'm a sports fan, and I have a lot of sports cards, hundreds of thousands of baseball and football, basketball cards, hockey cards. I read in the paper here in Chicago that a kid walked in to a baseball card store in Addison, Illinois, and this is in 1991, and the store owner was out to lunch, and a woman was watching the store, and a kid walked in and said, I want that card, and it was a Nolan Ryan, Jerry Koosman, 1968 Topps rookie card, and it was, the price on that was $1200, and the kid said, here's $12, and the woman gave him the card, and when the store owner came back,
oh my God.
The store owner came back, the woman watching the store told the store owner what she had done, and he said, that wasn't $12, that was $1,200, describe the kid. She described the kid, and the guy said, well, that kid's in here all the time, he knows that's $1,200. So he called the police. They filed a police report. They went over to the kid's house. They took the card. And it was kind of a big story here in Chicago. So
did the kid win?
Well, so I called the kid's attorney, and I called the store owner's attorney, and I said, I've got this beautiful auction hall in Chicago. Would you like to auction the card and give the proceeds to charity to settle the dispute? And they both thought that was a great idea.
That was very smart of you.
Well, I was trying to get promotion, and my degree was in marketing. So I called channel 2, 5, and 7. I planned it for a Friday. It was a slow news day. They all came and carried it live. There was a local sportscaster named 𝗕𝗢𝗢𝗞𝗢𝗥, who's been around for 30 or 40, 50 years almost here in Chicago. And I asked him if he would co-MC it with me. He said for a 6-pack of Diet Coke and some discount on antique furniture, he would. And channel 2, 5, and 7 came, carried it live. I called every baseball, football, hockey, and basketball team in the country. 45 of them donated items. And we did the card and those items. And the card that was worth $1,200, we sold for $5,000. The kid gave his charity, his money to Alhambra, a home for troubled kids, I think, in the suburbs. And the store owner gave his proceeds to Ronald McDonald House. And so we raised $25,000 for charity. I didn't take a thing. The guy I was working for didn't take a thing. Right, from that auction. And I thought to myself, how is it possible that we just sold a $1,200 baseball card for $5,000? And I thought, wow, these auctions are a great way to ask for the order, you know, to create an urgency. The next day I was on the cover of the Tribune and the Sun-Times, and you can still Google Rick Levin, Nolan Ryan, Chicago Tribune, and read the story. It's in the Tribune's archives. And I was on the lead story on News Radio 78, and I thought, this is pretty cool. So then a few months later, a couple women walked in the building and said they were from Seattle. Their mom had passed away, their aunt had passed away. They had a house in Chicago filled with stuff, and they wanted to get rid of the stuff. And they came and they said, can you auction the stuff? And I said, what are you going to do with the house? And they said, as soon as you get rid of the stuff, we're going to give it to a conventional broker to sell the house. And I said, do you mind letting me maybe auction the house as well as the contents? Now the contents, if you have something very valuable, if it's personal property, not real estate, personal property, anything but real estate, Sotheby's and Christie's in New York does a great job. And there's some nice personal property auction halls here in Chicago. But something really expensive, you probably should ship to New York or London, Monets and Van Goghs and all the rest. You don't see a lot of that being sold here in Chicago.
Yeah, not the right market for it.
Probably not. And she wanted about, and the percentages that you can charge are pretty attractive on this chair that I'm sitting in. This chair probably was bought for $100, but if this place goes bankrupt and you have to sell this chair, it probably sells for $10 because it's probably beat up. And even if you can charge a 10 or 20 or 30% commission, by the time it's picked up and it's moved and the leg is broken and people are yelling at you, you earn $3 and everybody's mad at you, and you got to sell a lot of chairs to make a living. Yeah. But so I sold the house. They wanted about $200,000, and I sold the house for $190. And I don't know if it was worth $210 or $180 or $200, but the buyer was delighted and the seller was delighted. And I was about 24, and I said, everybody's happy? I can keep this fee? And they said, yeah. And so
what was the fee then?
I think I charged 5 or 6%. Okay. You know, so
typical fees is today.
Yeah, yeah. There is no typical fee with brokers, as you know. You can charge anything you want, and consumers can pay anything you want. But I thought it was reasonable, and since I called my mom, I was 24, I said, Mom, you know, I can order pizza with 3 ingredients, I can get HBO and Showtime, I don't need to borrow money this month. And since then, I've gone on to do thousands of auctions, and it's been office buildings and shopping centers and builder closeouts, the last 5 or 10 or 15 homes, townhomes, condos, hundreds of parking spots around downtown Chicago. I got back into personal property auctions. I did the police squad of 100 cars and garbage trucks and street cleaners for the Chicago Housing Authority when they were going through their transformation. The Chicago Transit Authority had me auction memorabilia a few years ago, including some old CTA train cars. In real estate,
what type of people bought those cars?
Well, one of the rail cars I sold to, I believe, a grocery store in Ohio that's using it as a display. And another one of the grocery cars I think was bought by Google, who might be using it as a display in their building in the West Loop for employees or something. I think the CTA sells a lot of rail cars for just to melt down the metal for recycling. But I think I sold mine for a much higher price for people that really wanted to use them.
Yeah, because of course the right setting is going to look great.
You bet. I was thinking they could be like made into like an Airbnb. If you put them on a rail, people could sleep the night really cool in a CTA car. The Postal Service, of course, let me auction the big post office at the Eisenhower goes underneath, and we got them $25 million. Bank of America, Chase, Harris, Fannie Mae did hundreds and hundreds of foreclosed properties during the recession, 2008 to 2012. The life changer for me was probably the FDIC that let me do, I think, over 500 auctions all around the country for personal property from failed banks. Okay. And then still today I do an auction every year. A couple weeks ago we had our auction this year for the U.S. Army. We do an auction for personal property. We do auctions every year for the last 9 years for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, cigarettes around the country. And then I've been very lucky to do joint ventures with conventional brokers the last few years. Lots of vacant land. 2 years ago, we did a closed hospital in Elgin. A year and a half ago, we did a closed high school in Lansing. So right now, we're doing a closed zoo amusement park in Michigan, in Coloma, Michigan. But also vacant land in Rockford. Lots of vacant land right now in Rockford, and vacant land in Morton Grove. And the sellers are private sellers, and they're sometimes they're companies, sometimes they're wealthy people, sometimes they're poor people, divorcing couples, the heirs of wealthy people, all kinds of interesting situations. But usually they all have one theme, and that is somebody who is got realistic price expectations and wants to sell their property sooner rather than later. And if we can create some kind of marketplace with an urgency, again, for people to step up and really make a real offer that closes, the auction can work very well. And so after thousands of them, it's been, an interesting 30 years.
How do people find you to do this? And where do you think that seed gets planted to auction something? Because it's not the conventional method.
Right.
I don't think of auctioning as a viable method.
Right.
And then you do some research and you're like, okay, so in Australia, that's how they sell all their property.
Well, that's not how they sell all, but the majority of properties sold in Perth, Australia, a big city. In 1970, it was mostly private treaty, like it is now here in the United States. But in Perth now, if you go on their websites of like Century 21, which is a large conventional brokerage company here in the United States, go to Century 21 Perth, it's mostly auction.
Yeah.
The normal way to sell a farm, a piece of real estate in the United States, in a rural area, the normal way to sell a farm is at auction.
Really?
If someone sold it private treaty, they'd be like, what's wrong with it?
Yeah.
The normal way to sell...
When you say private treaty...
That means conventional.
Okay.
The way to think about auctions differently than conventional is that in a conventional real estate sale, like most real estate brokers practice, in a conventional sale, the seller sets the price and the buyer sets the terms. Seller wants 500 grand, the buyer comes in and makes an offer. With an auction, it's total opposite. The seller sets the terms. We actually even draft a real estate contract pre-approved by the seller and their attorney. The seller sets the terms. Here's the contract that we're going to want you to sign, and the buyer sets the price. And the way that works is sometimes we do auctions what we call absolute, which means the seller gets it regardless of price, as long as they sign that purchase agreement that the seller and the seller's attorney.
The buyer gets it regardless of price, right?
The buyer gets it regardless of price.
So that means there's no reserve.
That's correct. It means it's absolute, no reserve. The second way you do these auctions are with reserve, where the seller can accept or reject any offer. And the third way we do these auctions is a published minimum bid, where there's a floor. And anything above that floor, the seller is willing to accept. Ironically, here in Chicago, nobody remembers this. I don't even think the Chicago Association of Realtors remembers this, because they've only been around, I think, since the 1870s or 80s. But in the 1840s, 200 years ago, 180 years ago, 170 years ago, the normal way to sell real estate in Chicago was at auction. And you can look it up in your history books, but nobody will. If you think about it, the fanciest things in the world, cars, certainly artwork, certainly eBay has built out a niche of selling things at auction. The New York Stock Exchange is an auction. The Merck, the Board of Trade, is an auction. The U.S. government refinances the national debt every week at a treasury auction. If they had to take a Monet and somebody really wanted to sell it, they wouldn't just stick a price tag on it and stick it in a store and just wait. They'd be like, what's up with that? Real estate actually has holding costs, taxes. In a market like Chicago, we've got cold weather. There might be reasons why people really want to take their life under their control and decide when they want to sell an asset. So then the hard part is to find buyers, or to create a market, really. eBay has done a great job of finding a market for Beanie Babies, or maybe baseball cards, or Pez dispensers, which is how 𝗕𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗢, the starter of eBay, supposedly started eBay when his girlfriend, his girlfriend, he was helping her buy and sell used Pez dispensers, which is a collectible.
Yeah.
So if you could
I
start
went to a listing once, and the entire basement
was
ceiling
Pez dispensers.
was Pez dispensers.
Yeah.
The thousands.
Yeah.
It was kind of cool.
I think there's a restaurant right up by Wrigley Field that sells like noodles that has a big Pez dispenser display. It's right on Sheffield, I believe.
Okay.
It's half a block south of Addison. But anyway, if you can create a marketplace for townhomes or condos, or if you think about it, if you were to pick a geographic area, let's pick on Glencoe. Glencoe's a nice, desirable subdivision. If you made a edict, a law, that all homes in Glencoe must be sold at auction. That's no ifs, ands, or buts. That means everybody who buys a home in Glencoe would have to buy at auction. That means that the values of homes in Glencoe would be perfect, because buyers and sellers cannot disagree, because everybody knows there's an auction once a month or once a quarter, and you put the homes for sale there. You may or may not need real estate appraisers anymore. Sorry, real estate appraisers. Because if every property was sold at auction, the definition of value usually is something's worth what someone's willing to pay for it, especially if it's a well-publicized sale of whatever the asset is. Yeah. So that would be a very unique situation. Lenders would probably love it, because they would probably loan 70 or 80 or 90% of whatever the auction brought, and there wouldn't be much dispute as to what that was the market value, because that's what the well-publicized, everybody knew auction. You may disagree with the price of IBM shares or General Electric shares, but there's no doubt there's an auction going on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange right now for IBM and GE shares. So whatever those sell for is pretty efficient. The irony and the conundrum, to use an Alan Greenspan expression, the conundrum for me has always been, after over 30 years of doing this, is that the time to do an auction is when the market's strong, especially when there's more buyers than there are sellers. That's the way a seller could maximize price. That's like Econ 101. More buyers than sellers is how you maximize price. So when times are good like they are now, and if anybody's watching this, we're in this late summer, fall of 2021. When times are good right now, it's really well known that there's a shortage of properties in certain markets, and this would be a great time for sellers to do auctions. But because prices are going up 1 or 2% a month in some instances, when I talk to sellers and I say, hey, you want to do an auction? They say, nah, I'm in no hurry, because if I don't sell it at my dream price right now, next month it'll be worth 1 or 2% less. Ironically, when the market has a correction, like markets tend to do, because nothing goes up forever, like in 2008 to 2012, when prices were going down, that's when everybody wants to do an auction, and that's when supply is greater than demand, which technically is the wrong time to do an auction, because you technically get lower prices because demand is greater than supply. But I think it's the only thing I can equate it to is, I guess, in the stock market. When the stock market's at an all-time high, everybody stands around the water cooler and they talk about how well their Google and Facebook and Tesla stock is doing, and then everybody says, oh, this is a great time to buy stocks. It's probably the wrong time to buy stocks when they're at an all-time high. The right time to buy them is when there's been a big correction, but human nature is such that we don't want to buy things when
we keep going back
they're on
in.
It's funny, I mean, if Macy's put out a big ad and said, prices are at an all-time high for sweaters, you know, I don't know if everybody would rush in and buy a sweater. They'd wait till prices come back down. But in real estate right now, prices are at an all-time high in many places, and people are rushing in to buy. And yet when prices have a big correction, that's when we all get scared in the stock market, in the real estate market. It gets kind of the conversation we were having before, really, about having self-control. So that's how I've gotten into it. And it's been a lot of fun. And I have had, you know, I've done thousands of real estate auctions, and there's been just some great stories of things that weren't supposed to sell for a lot of money that did. And then I've had other stories where things that were supposed to sell for a lot of money didn't sell for as much. And a lot of it is just to figure out what the seller's motivation is. I had a seller call me yesterday, and they're in their 80s, and they've been trying to sell a property for a while. And they said, you know, I'd like to just have closure to my ownership of this property. We did an auction last year for some vacant land in West Chicago, and it was a charitable organization that owned it. And for some reason, I just happened to ask them, how long have you had the 42 acres. How long have you had the 42 acres on the market for sale? And they said it's been 45 years. So, yeah, you heard me. It's been 45 years. So I thought, well, that's unusual. So they were looking for a way to find closure. And I think when it comes to unique, now that's an extreme example, but I think when it comes to unique, unusual properties, I don't know why someone wouldn't do an auction, because it's a one of a kind. So comps don't really help. That's the definition of unique. There aren't a lot of comps. I understand something that's cookie cutter. If you're selling a townhome in a townhome community and all townhomes sell for 300, whether yours has a nice finished basement or not, if the range of sales has always been 270 to 330 the last 5 years, that's probably, you could price yours anywhere from 330 to 270. But if you have a unique one of a kind asset, it would seem to me that an auction would be the way to go. And then you just have to decide if you're going to do it absolute, which shows you're very serious. Probably brings more buyers because you're telling the world, I'm not screwing around, I'm selling this to the high bidder. Or you sell it with reserve, which means you can accept or reject any offer. It gives the seller a lot of comfort. Sometimes it makes the buyer nervous that the seller's not sincere. Or the third method, you come up with a minimum bid, a floor, and anything above that floor, you, the seller, are obligated to take. And hopefully that floor is an attractive number, and if it's attractive enough, buyers will come, because buyers know that maybe if they're the only ones that show up, they'll at least be able to, kind of like Priceline, they'll be able to name their own price for that attractive asset, in this case a piece of real estate.
Is the reserve price always published?
No. Oh, no. No. Well, as a matter of fact, in the case of the way I've done auctions, years ago, I used to ask sellers for their reserve number. But I have found that most sellers don't exactly know what they'll take for their real estate.
So they have to wait until they see what comes in?
Yeah, I mean, if you're encumbered with a mortgage and you can't pay a deficiency, then you become like a prisoner to your property. And I meet a lot of people that look affluent and they owe $1 million on their $900,000 home.
I know a lot of people like that.
Yeah, and they, in Texas they call it big hat, no cattle.
Yeah.
But they can make their payments, but they can't really sell the property. So sometimes they call, and I say to them, but what happens if we get 800 or 900 or 950 or $1 million? They say they probably cannot make the transaction happen because they won't have enough money to do the proceeds. So they're probably not a candidate for auction. And I feel bad when a conventional broker takes that listing, because unless the conventional broker gets lucky and gets them $1.2 million, I don't know how you're going to get $1.2 million for a house that's worth 900 to $1.1 million. But if you get $1.2 million, a transaction could happen. But more often than not, the listing languishes on the market. So people who are better sellers for conventional brokers or better sellers for auctioneers are typically people that have a lower mortgage or no mortgage. And then when I meet those kind of people, I ask them, well, what's your motivation? You know, what are you trying to accomplish? Well, we moved to California 2 years ago, and we've had the house listed for 2 years with a couple different brokers. Well, there's obviously something's wrong. Someone's pricing it wrong, or something's wrong.
Now it's stigmatized.
Well, that's true. That stigma is, people talk to me about a stigma of an auction, and these are people that have listed their property for 4 years. And I always say, well, what about the stigma that's been on and off the market for 4 years? They look at me like they have no idea what I'm talking about. And I say, well, you know, if property's been out there, you just said 2 years. It's been out there 2, 3, 4 years.
In this market, if a single family home is on the market for more than a month, there's stigma.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I mean, that's pretty aggressive that you'd say that, but okay. I would say 3 months, 6 months, but whatever. They typically, to answer your question from before, very often they don't exactly know what their property is worth. If they exactly knew what it was worth, probably before they met me, they could have priced it exactly at that number or 5% less, and they would get a rather quick sale. I end up often doing auctions for people that own properties that the exact number is not so easy to figure out, or there's no urgency. For example, the hardest thing to typically sell is vacant land. and I end up selling a lot of vacant land. I mean, I do office buildings and shopping centers, but I guess we can pick on office buildings or shopping centers right now, or restaurants. Like during the pandemic last year, and you know, people weren't running to shopping centers, and Amazon is hurting shopping centers. And so then there's a question of what's a shopping center worth if it loses a couple of its anchors. You know, you can look at the income approach, but maybe the income's down right now. You could look at the comparable approach, but a shopping center in one suburb might not be exactly comparable to the next suburb. So then you can look at the replacement approach. I love the replacement approach, but that's not exactly germane.
I mean, that gives it its highest value, really.
Very often it does. Well, sometimes the income approach could, if you own the corner of Main and Main and you've got a small space and some crazy entity is willing to pay you a fortune to promote their business. But yeah, the replacement value often gives me the highest value. When we were auctioning the post office for the Postal Service, it was almost 3 million square feet, and it was built over an interstate highway, which they won't be building buildings over interstate highways. And so
That building had windows that would fall off.
well, even at $100 a foot, which you could never build that building for, we valued it at $300 million, but they were expecting to get $10. So yes, in some cases the replacement value could make you look like a superstar, but there's many jurisdictions around the United States where places like California, where it's really hard to build in some places and really expensive to build, that you can't just go on replacement value, or else you'd get a lot more than properties are trading for. But I think it's a fine line. You have to finesse it, but you really have to know what the seller's motivation is, and then we find out what the buyers will pay. But creating the urgency is just so important, because if we skip over to a class like vacant land, if you own land on the wrong side of the expressway, the wrong side being the development is all on this side, but you own land on the other side, and that development won't be coming for another 10 years, but you want to take a trip around the world, or you want to pay for your kids' college, or you want to start a new business, and you want to take the largest asset class in the United States, which is real estate. If you add up the value of all the real estate in the United States, that's worth more than all the stocks and bonds put together. If you want to add a little liquidity to an illiquid asset, because on your financial statement, your stocks and bonds and cash are your liquid assets, your real estate are your non-liquid assets, how do you get someone who owns land on the wrong side of the expressway? And I mean wrong, I mean there's just nothing happening right now.
I think you described it well. It's the development's on this side,
right,
and it's probably 10 years
right.
before
It's
this.
nothing. It's for no other reason than it's just not in great demand right now. How do you, and I do this in air quotes, how do you find the market? And that might be disappointing to a seller, because in many cases the seller might be better off waiting 10 years till the development jumps the expressway to his or her side, and then they could,
it's vacant land, the
it's
taxes
perfect.
are low.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
But so the holding cost isn't bad for them, and the holding cost wouldn't be bad for a buyer either. But that you get into the situation of, if I'm asking you to buy something, but you have no use for it right now for the next 10 years, what are you willing to pay for it? That's tough.
Yeah.
That's tough. And I'm gonna ask you to take money out of your Google and Tesla and Facebook stock and out of your piggy bank. And
Everyone looks at the opportunity cost there too. When you have someone look at stocks like, I don't want to do it today.
Right. It's the opportunity cost, for sure. But remember, the person that owns that land on the wrong side of the expressway right now, where nothing's happening, wants to take that trip around the world. They need to take that trip, or they got bills to pay, or whatever their reason is, and they want to find the market. Well, that's where an auction's really great. And that can be for an office building, a shopping center, it could be for a home, a condo, a parking spot, a post office. We did a closed library for the Huntley Library District. I mean, there are lots of unusual assets. The value can be determined. And you can get to a number where hopefully buyer and seller agree, so a transaction can happen. So it's been interesting. And the buyers and the sellers are interesting. Never a dull moment. Yeah.
How do you market the property to the satisfaction of the seller? Because
That's a great question. There was a time here in Chicago where the Chicago Tribune on Sunday the real estate section was very thick, and most people, residential and commercial, looked to the Sunday Tribune real estate section, and it was great because it was almost like kind of like Wall Street back in the 18 or 1700s, where everybody who were buying stock all met at the same post. Today, people get their real estate information from 1,000 different places. So it is very hard to market, to answer your question, to market real estate to the seller's satisfaction, because it almost requires you to do everything.
Yeah.
But how can you afford to do everything for one $300,000, $400,000 property? To do everything, you may have to spend millions.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really make sense to do everything. But of course, the seller wants you to do everything, because how can the seller trust that you've gotten the market price if you don't do everything?
Yeah.
So one example is the multiple listing service. The multiple listing service about 20 years ago started accepting auction listings. So the MLS, you can now put a property on there and call it an auction. The problem with that is some brokers don't really understand or want to participate in an auction. So that's problematic, because the method that you're selling the property might be a turnoff to some brokers and to some buyers, for that matter. Some buyers might say, I don't want to be pressured into making a decision now.
Or what's wrong with the property that you're selling at auction. I
And
hear
that's
that from people all the time.
That's a problem. And
Because
that's
auction is associated with banks and
Right.
REOs
Right.
and with 2008 to 2012.
But you know what's funny? They're really associated with the 1930s during the Great Depression. That's where it got the bad
Is that
name.
where it started?
Yeah, and it's
I
only
think foreclosures.
right, but
is
it's
that
only
happening
real
then, too?
estate. It's only real estate in metropolitan areas. If you told me you had a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, and you were selling it, if you watch cable TV, you'll see a lot of shows about high-end car auctions. The normal way for you to sell your Ferrari or Lamborghini or your high-end vintage car is at auction.
Yeah.
The normal way for you to sell your high-end jewelry might be at auction. Your artwork. Almost every asset class, including NFTs, non-fungible tokens, they're being sold at auction. They're not just putting a price tag on them. It's only real estate in metropolitan areas, not farms. Remember, the normal way is at auction. And it's a misunderstanding that consumers have and brokers have about the virtues of auction. But trying to change people's behavior is very difficult.
Yeah,
And
it's
especially,
expensive.
well, very expensive, and especially when you're talking about someone's biggest asset. You know, you might be willing to do it with your Pez dispenser or your Beanie Baby.
People that want to take the risk.
And I would say baseball card, but there have been a couple baseball cards this year that have sold for over $3 million. One I think just sold for $5 or $6 million. But again, they sell at auction. They're not putting a price tag on it. And that's how they got to that price, was because of the dynamic pricing that an auction is, where one bidder outbids the next bidder and the prices keep going higher till you arrive at the final price. A lot of people like auctions too. We've done, I've done hundreds and hundreds of government auctions for the U.S. Treasury, the IRS, the Secret Service, Customs, for airplanes and boats and cars all over the country. And a lot of people, a lot of sellers like auctions, especially government entities, because there is transparency. There's how you got to that price. And I always wonder if a seller is selling a piece of real estate in a metropolitan area and they don't do an auction. I often wonder how they know they've gotten the top dollar. As a matter of fact, some real estate brokers steal the terminology from auctions. They say, oh, we've got a couple people bidding on this house.
Yeah.
And in San Francisco and in other really hot markets, conventional brokers are actually listing a house on a Friday for $1 million, and they're asking for best and final on Sunday, and it sells for $1 million, 1 or 2 or 3.
Or 2 million or 3 million, yeah.
I saw a company just listed a property a few blocks from here, and it's called, I don't want to be an ad for them, I don't know much about them, but they're called Unlisted Price Real Estate Company.
Okay.
And they're doing everything that's an auction, except they're not using the word auction.
Interesting. You think it might be because of the stigma that's attached to the word?
Probably.
Yeah.
I remember, I think it was Coldwell Banker about 10 years ago, did something called value range pricing.
Okay.
They tried it for about a year or two. I think they did it here in Chicago and around the country. And that's where, instead of putting an asking price, they said this home's worth, the asking price of this home is $300,000 to $400,000.
Does the MLS allow you to do that?
I don't believe it does here in Northern Illinois.
Okay.
But, you know, if enough real estate brokers want the MLS to reprogram it, I think they're willing to do that. Just the way they added auctions years ago. Because for the longest time, we couldn't put things on the MLS.
Auctions makes sense to me. A lot of the biggest reasons because of transparency. If so many buyers get frustrated when they're bidding on properties and then the home closes 45 days later and they're like, I would have paid that.
Right.
And it gives them that real moment, real time setting
Right.
where they can say, I'm willing to pay this, let's do it.
Oh, I think that's a great reason. I mean, that's a great reason. Again, I don't know why someone would sell their $1 million painting at an auction and not their $1 million home. Because one's with canvas and paint and the other's with bricks and sticks. Doesn't seem to make sense to me.
That's very catchy.
Yeah, it doesn't
that
seem,
could be a tagline.
yeah, it doesn't seem to make sense to me. But it's a perception. It's a perception.
How do the fees work?
Typically, there's a couple fees. One fee is often the seller contributes some money up front to assist with advertising and marketing.
Okay.
And that's always a negotiation. It depends on the property, depends on the seller, and it depends on how much promotion you need to get
Is
to the
that true
property.
for personal property as well?
It can be. It depends. It depends. It also depends on if the seller is selling the property absolute with reserve or minimum bid. If there's a greater chance that a sale is going to occur, like in an absolute sale, perhaps some of the fees would be lower. And then typically the success fees are either a commission charge to the seller or a buyer's premium, which is like a tax or an add-on or a fee charged to a buyer.
Yeah.
But they all have to make business sense or the seller won't do it. And we also like to leave a little fee for a broker that might bring a buyer. We're trying to encourage conventional brokers to participate in auctions by offering them a fee if they bring a buyer. And before 2008, I think very few brokers, conventional brokers, wanted to be involved with auctions. But in 2008 to 2012, a lot of properties were sold that way. So it forced brokers to kind of educate themselves a little bit. Even the National Association of Realtors, the largest trade association in the United States, based here in Chicago, has booklets and pamphlets about real estate auctions. And years ago, I was on a committee for NAR where we tried to encourage more and more brokers to think about auction marketing. And in some markets, conventional realtors, members of the National Association of Realtors, have a very large auction presence in areas like, I believe, Nashville and Memphis and some of the smaller communities around the country. I pick on Nashville and Memphis because in places in Kentucky, the way they sell thoroughbred horses are at auction. Mm-hmm. So everybody knows about auctions.
Yeah.
And again, back to rural parts of the country, priced cattle are always sold at auction. Mm-hmm. And in smaller markets where there's a lot of farms but also a lot of houses, very often you'll find NAR members who sell farms, but they also sell houses in the city center, and often they just auction the houses in the city center. So it's not that unusual for realtor members to be doing auctions. It's just a little unusual in some of the bigger cities. And in some of the bigger cities that they are doing auctions, they're not calling it an auction.
I grew up on a farm, and I used to love going to the auction because you used to buy a hay truck full of things,
Right.
and they would just have them full of stuff and like bid on this. They'd be bidding on everything.
Right.
You could buy 50 tractors at once, or you could buy a horse. You could buy anything you want there. And just the process of watching this all happen, and people going around kicking the tires, was interesting and fun as a kid. I mean, it was a fun place to be.
Yeah, when I was younger, I did storage locker auctions where we would get hired by the storage locker company. If someone didn't pay for their storage locker, we would auction the contents of the storage locker. And they have those shows on TV now, yeah, so it's interesting. And by the way, they do those auctions because they want to clear out that space and they want there to be transparency and openness for what the contents of the locker sell for. And those are reasons that consumers should love.
Yes. Some of the most fun I ever had in real estate. I got my license in 2009, great time. And in 2010, I had a client who had lots of financial backing. We went to an auction.com in-person auction. We bought over $2 million in real estate.
Yeah, that's great.
And it was the coolest thing.
And they're now called 10X. They've morphed into 10X.
That's the same company? Because I know.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
And at that auction, I bought a property for $12,500. And I just sold that property for like 10 times that.
Well, remember, it was 2009.
Yeah.
So 2009 was good for buyers,
Yes.
bad for sellers. And so smart people buy things, if they have the resources, when it's bad for sellers and good for buyers. That's just Econ 101. And the irony is, in 2009, there were more sellers than buyers, and it was a bad time to be a seller. If you had the option of when to sell your piece of real estate, chances are you should not have done it in 2009. Now, there were people that had to, like GMAC Finance and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and Bank of America and others, because they weren't in the business of owning real estate. So it would come into their purview and they'd have to get rid of it. And sometimes supply and demand were out of whack, where just too much inventory was coming in too fast. And so they had to put it out on the market and dispose of it in a timely, orderly way. So an auction made a lot of sense. Ironically, an auction makes a lot of sense right now for a lot of sellers. They just don't think about doing it.
What do you think with the eviction moratoriums and everything that's happened? Do you think that's going to create some type of new environment where there's going to be more real estate on the market?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I was really busy in 2008 to 2012 because we had a lot of sellers. I wasn't happy about it because we also need a lot of buyers, and we didn't have a lot of buyers. And I wasn't happy to be busy because I knew there was a lot of pain and suffering that some of those sellers' clients had gone through.
It's hard to be a part of that. I've been in that situation a number of times where the sale is the last thing this person wants to do. They're forced to do it. And not one moment of that, even getting a check.
It's pleasurable. Yeah. But board up companies needed to board up places. It's a necessity. And locksmiths had to change locks. So they were busy. When the pandemic broke out last year, I really thought that, I wasn't sure about residential properties, but I thought commercial properties, we could be in for another situation where things had to be repriced. Office buildings, shopping centers. Like, what's an office building worth if tenants don't want to renew their lease because they're letting their employees work at home? What's an office building worth? Maybe a law firm that rents 100,000 square feet only needs to rent 50,000 because, or 15. Okay, well then you're going to have to, but they have 7 years left on their lease, so you have to reprice the building based on the current rent, the replacement, right, of that building, the comparables, if you can find any of that building, and what the future rental incomes might be if remote work is going to be something we do for a long time. So I really thought everything was going to be repriced. I have not seen that. I have not seen shopping centers, office buildings, movie theaters, a lot of closed restaurants. I haven't seen a lot of those rushing to do an auction to figure out what they're worth. I don't know if the government's done a great job, or if sellers don't want to like capitulate and throw in the towel.
You think they're biding time?
Maybe. Well, certainly the government's helped them because there's been a lot of financial bailouts with PPP loans and all the rest, and moratoriums and other things like that. So we'll see. The question is, can the government keep printing money and keeping everything afloat? Up until now, it's been amazing how stable things have been through a terrible health crisis.
It feels unreal.
Almost.
Yeah.
Maybe too good to be true,
It's hard
right?
to believe.
Yeah, it's hard to believe.
Yeah.
Like you watch on the news suffering, and the stock market's at an all-time high, and interest rates are low, and of course there's a chip shortage with new cars, but everybody's buying cars and houses, like you just said. So we'll see.
What happens when someone bids on a property or bids on a piece of property or personal property, whatever it is, and they can't pay the bill?
Well, that's a problem, and typically we like to qualify people, and the way we tend to qualify people in the case of real estate is earnest money, typically somewhere around 10%. And it's been my experience with thousands of auctions that nobody bids 100 grand, $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, $5 million, puts down 10%, $10,000, $20,000, $100,000, and then doesn't mean well, and sign an all-cash non-contingent contract. My experience is 99% of the time, they put down non-refundable earnest money, they close.
What's that time period? Where they have to put
45 days typically.
No, not for the closing. To put down the earnest money.
Oh, typically immediately.
Right there, right?
Yeah.
On the spot.
If it's a
That's
live
what
auction,
happened at that one auction.
yeah, if it's a live auction, it's immediately. If it's a sealed bid auction, they have to submit their bid with it. If it's an online auction, either it's within a day, or we require them to tender a little earnest money to us before we even let them bid.
I was going to ask
So that
that was my next question.
we can qualify them, make sure that they are.
At these high price tags, do you do that in order just to participate and be in the room?
Yeah, yeah, and there is no objection. There's a lot of protected classes, but money is not a protected class. And asking someone to show their sincerity by putting down some earnest money, even being before allowed to bid, is still lawful. And I think it's appropriate. It's really appropriate for the seller, because you're trying to do right by your client, and you don't want to. It's like throwing a wedding and the band doesn't show up or the caterer doesn't show up. So you don't want to throw an auction and let someone who is unqualified bid. It's also not fair to the other bidders, because I don't want someone bidding $1 million and then someone saying $1.1 million, $1.2 million, if the person they're bidding against isn't qualified. So you need to have everybody bidding on an equal playing field. So asking everyone to show a little earnest money in this case, is I think appropriate, and it really makes everybody be very straightforward about their dealings, which is very important.
If the person's unable to move forward with the purchase,
Right.
do you go to the next person in line, or how do you
Yeah,
work that?
typically, I mean, I think for thousands of auctions, I can count on maybe one or two hands deals that didn't close once it was signed, and maybe someone died in between the time of the auction and the time of the closing, and their estate didn't want to go forward with the purchase.
So there's extenuating circumstances that led to the situation.
You bet, it's very unusual. And the seller can elect to give back the earnest money, perhaps, if it's an unusual situation. I remember once, years ago, a woman came and bought a condo, and she called us a couple days later and said her husband's threatening divorce. If we buy that condo, she'll just walk from her $8,000 earnest money. And the seller had to decide what to do. But it's very unusual. Nobody, I don't care how wealthy you are, nobody wants to lose $5,000 or $10,000.
The wealthier you are, the more that bothers you.
Yeah, and so we would try to remake the deal. We would go to the, I would do typically whatever the seller told me to do, but usually the seller would tell me, see if you can find someone else who wants to buy the property. Now, if it's 45 days later, the bummer is some of those buyers have gone on and bought something else. So that really hurts the seller. And so the buyer, the original buyer, maybe should be punished and lose their earnest money. If the buyer calls us the next day and says, gee, they were intoxicated. When intoxicated, you get your money back in Illinois, in most states. But the buyer changed their mind. At least maybe that's a little easier to try to remake the deal the next day, while there still might be fresh buyers out there.
And you probably have people that wanted it, so they're excited at the opportunity.
You bet. Sometimes people even, I'll tell you, this has happened to me plenty, where this is the other side of the coin of what you're asking. Sometimes someone calls me the day after a live auction and says they were there, they stopped bidding at $400, they see the high winning bidder was at $401,000. They thought about it last night. If that person doesn't perform at 401, they'd be happy to pay 402. And I say, yeah, I know, I wish you would have said that yesterday at the auction. So I've had that happen a number of times. Because we always used to remind people that the difference of paying $1,000 more on a 30-year mortgage
It's so silly. It's
is
nothing.
like $5-6.
Yeah, it's nothing.
You know, a month. Eat macaroni and cheese tonight instead of ordering
Just
a
don't go to
pizza.
Starbucks this week.
Well, right. I like Starbucks, but you're right. I understand what you're saying. So people have to keep that all in perspective. You know, I think the best auction buyers are the ones that have done their homework. They know what they can afford. They know what they think is a good value on the property, and they come and they don't pay more than they intended to pay. They don't get caught up in any kind of like auction fever and keep going to some crazy number that was inappropriate for them to bid in the first place. So I like them to be educated.
I bought a piece of art once at an auction, and I got right to my limit, but I paid it, and I was happy about it. I'm still happy about it. But it was a perfect example to see how they got the maximum value of this item, right? And that's exactly what it was.
Well, you're an ad for real estate auctions now.
Yeah.
That's really the deal. I mean, I do believe in their purest form, when properly executed, auctions are the best way to sell stuff. And that's why it's been around for thousands of years. Auctions have been around for thousands of years. And that's why the fanciest, most expensive things in the world are sold at auction.
When you see a property like Michael Jordan's property,
Right.
which is that sold yet?
No, and a company from out of town, I hate to pick on other companies, came to town and they did, okay, well they did, good, okay. They did an auction for that property. I believe it's still available. They did an auction 5, 6, 7 years ago. I believe they advertised an absolute auction, and I believe the day before or the morning of, they stopped the auction before it started or something, which I found to be inappropriate and disappointing.
What a waste of resources and
they had great promotion on that property, and it's been a thorn in my side because people ask me all the time, how did that Michael Jordan auction go?
Yeah.
That was on the Today Show and Good Morning America. And I said, I think they canceled the auction. So that was disappointing. There must have been some kind of miscommunication, I can only assume, between the people that were involved in that auction. But it's a head scratcher for me what happened there. And I don't like anybody, you know, when you're in a profession, it's like if somebody says, you know, all dentists, you know, I went to a dentist once and the dentist didn't do a good job, therefore I shouldn't go to a dentist anymore.
Well, you're a realtor and I'm a realtor, but I'm a realtor, and that's everyday scenario, right?
Right.
We get some of the worst reps.
So I wanted that auction to be successful, and I was disappointed that it wasn't successful, but to my knowledge, it wasn't successful. The property's still on the market. Now, I don't want to get into saying anything about the auction company or the seller, but I will say that the property itself, I don't think is in the most desirable part of Highland Park, because the most desirable part is probably closer to the lake. So that's a really unusual property, and an auction probably is a great way to sell it. But
I think it's the only way to sell that property.
yeah, but I think I don't understand why. You talked before about a stigma. That property's had a prolonged conventional marketing program and an auction that didn't result in a sale. So I don't know how you would describe that property now. Maybe an essay writing contest or a raffle, or maybe an auction. Or I have an idea. Rick Levin and Associates, an auction from a different auction company, maybe could take a crack at it. But if we do, we're going to sell it. We're going to sell it because it's a very sellable property.
Yeah.
The question is, what's the price? And it's worth what someone's willing to pay for it, not what some seller thinks it's worth. It's worth what the market will bear at a given time. This would seem to be a good time too. Stock market's at an all-time high.
It's the right time to buy that type of property with all the land and everything that comes with it.
Right.
How do people find you in this business?
Yeah.
How does the idea of an auction even come to a seller's mind?
Yeah, you know, that's a good question. We try to do a lot of media, but we don't do enough because nobody does. And we only have finite resources. You can't spend $1 million promoting a $100,000 property. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for conventional brokerage companies, and it certainly doesn't make sense for an auction company, especially when an auction company is trying to sell typically just a few properties. At least a conventional broker has the ability to sell thousands of properties at the same time. I do have a beef with conventional brokers though, and that is if you had 30 homes listed in one metro, in one community, people would say you're a genius, you're the guy who's got all those 30 homes listed, and if I wanted to sell my home there, I'd give you my home too, and now you'd have 31. The problem is there's only 5 buyers, so how do you show 5 buyers your 31 listings? That would seem to me to be a conflict of interest.
I've always thought the exact same
For the broker. So I like the auction mentality, hence I'm an auctioneer, where I won't take 31 listings in that subdivision from 31 different sellers at the same time. I will just take one, and my goal is actually to sell the one property. But you reach out to people through old media, new media, print, online, billboards if you can afford it, direct mail, word of mouth, and it's difficult. Marketing is difficult. The guy who started 𝗕𝗥𝗢𝗢𝗣𝗡 or 𝗕𝗢𝗢𝗡, a couple of the big, one of the guys, one of the big ad agencies. He's long dead, but his famous quote is that 90% of all advertising dollars are wasted. He just didn't know which 90%.
Yeah.
And I certainly subscribe to that. Like I have, I'll tell you something that works great. Real old school signage. Signage. And I've met a lot of sellers over the years who said, Rick, get me the highest price you can for my property, but just don't tell anybody that you're selling it. And don't put up a sign. I don't want a sign. I definitely don't want a sign. I don't want a sign that says auction, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know what the Joneses down the block are going to say.
The people I'll never talk to again once I leave.
Right. It's crazy. So I say, let me get this straight. You want me to get the highest price possible, but just don't tell anybody it's for sale. They said, exactly. That's tough. Those are tough sellers, whether you're conventional or an auctioneer. So, but signs do work.
In terms of old media and new media, it was funny. I saw that you're auctioning a billboard in Michigan.
Right.
And I have a good relationship with an older guy. He's like 70 years old. He's actually a friend of my dad's, but he lives in the city, and him and his wife come over. We hang out all the time. And I'm texting with him that morning. I'm like, what do you know about billboards? And he's like, we're talking a little bit back and forth. He doesn't know much, but he sends me a picture of your ad in the newspaper, and I send him a picture of your email.
Oh, that's funny.
And it just shows the age difference,
yeah,
right?
Right. Well,
but we were talking about the same thing, but we're both giving each other the same facts. And I was like, are you looking at this?
Yeah, age is probably a protected class too. I've noticed that some people do, certainly certain people are reading the newspaper or some are surfing online, but I have found that you have to do everything.
Yeah.
You have to do everything. And hopefully if you do enough, the seller is convinced, and this is really a big part of it, the seller is convinced that you've done a reasonable, and I mean this like in a nice way, a reasonable enough job marketing their property. And if they believe you've done a reasonable enough job, they're more inclined to accept the results of the auction. Another way that, of course, a seller might determine if a reasonable enough job was, we can inform them as to how many people contacted us. Then we can inform them of how many people came and looked at their property. And then you can just kind of use a reasonable person's litmus test of, gee, Rick, you've had nobody call and nobody looked at my property. I think whatever price you get me is going to stink. Or, gee, Rick, you've had 1,000 people call and hundreds of people here. I better accept whatever price you get me because that's probably the market. And when I say all that, the irony is I've had some open houses where we've had 100 different parties and the seller's been disappointed in the price. And we've had others where we've had 1 or 2 and the seller's okay. So it's not always a question of quantity. Sometimes it's quality. And the beautiful part about a piece of real estate typically is you really only need 1 buyer. You don't need 1,000. And if you had 1,000, they may or may not have done an auction anyway, because if there was really 1,000 people that wanted it, somebody might have just knocked on their door before I met them and bought it.
Yeah.
Because there was 1,000 people that wanted it at realistic prices. So,
The post office, to me, is one of the most impressive things that you've auctioned off. Can you talk about that process and what that looked like?
Sure. The Postal Service, I think at the time, either owned or managed 34,000 post offices around the country, and and they thought they were. It's been around since Benjamin Franklin, so they certainly think, first Postmaster General, they think they know real estate, and they built a new post office across the street, and that post office had sat for about 15 years, and in 2008 and 9, they were a deal that they had been working on for 10 or 15 years fell apart.
Working on a deal for 10 or 15 years?
Yeah.
To sell that property?
Yeah, with a prominent Chicago area business person. And so they said, let's auction it. And I said, how do you want to do it? Absolute with reserve, minimum bid. And they said, nope, absolute. Let's get rid of it. And they had me, they paid a lot of money up front for advertising and marketing. I advertised all over the world, and I had well over 1,000 inquiries, and hundreds of people came to look at it, and 27 people brought a cashier's check for $250,000 for a live auction we did out by O'Hare, because some people were flying in. And
interesting.
I timed the auction to coincide with the fact that Chicago was in the running for the Olympics. And between the day of the auction and the day of the closing, Chicago found out they came in 4th. That was for the 2016 Olympics. So the buyer we found was an interesting fella from London and Monaco, but he closed. He eventually closed for about 25 million bucks. And that was much more than most of the local real estate people wanted to pay. The building was daunting. I think 8 government entities have a say over what you can do there. It's on the Chicago, yeah, the lobbies on the National Historic Register. It's on the Chicago River, so you have to deal with the Water Reclamation District, maybe the Army Corps of Engineers. An interstate highway runs through it, so you have to deal with the Department of Transportation. I believe the fans beneath the building provide clean air for Union Station. So if you shut off your fans, you could suffocate people down there. So you had to take care of that. There was a lot of moving parts. And our due diligence package, we put together a due diligence package when we sell real estate, was this big. So we were burning it on CDs. I even asked the Postal Service if it was okay for me to FedEx some of the information. They said, sure, go ahead, because some of it was to overseas and stuff. And the person that bought it was eccentric. He did nothing with it for a long time. And then he found the 601 companies who bought it from him, and he died, I think, the day before or the day after the closing. And they've gone on to what looks to me like doing a beautiful job. They've got Uber taking 500,000 square feet, and Walgreens moving a big chunk of their operation from Deerfield, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago rented, I think, 123,000 square feet. And it's helped gentrify a whole area of downtown Chicago. And it was a great example of a unique, one-of-a-kind, hard-to-value piece of real estate where they probably should have auctioned it years sooner in hindsight. It was costing the post office millions a year to own it vacant, and they don't pay property taxes.
Oh, yeah, good point.
And by putting it back on the tax rolls, you help the greater community with tax revenue. And now you're creating maybe thousands of jobs in that building, and gentrifying a neighborhood. So, I think the auction, that's an example of an auction that I think was a win-win for everybody. The neighborhood, the community, the seller, the buyers. So.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Of course.
I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Very thorough in all the explanations,
Well,
and you clearly have this down.
Over 30 years, so yes, I can do auctions in my sleep. I think about them a lot.
So before we go,
Yeah.
do you actually like?
We did a lot of live auctions, but when I used to meet people in a bar, they'd say talk fast, But the FDIC had us do over 500 auctions all online. We do a lot of auctions online. That's a great way to see how many people are really bidding and track exactly where their bids were. It's great for transparency and openness. We do a lot of sealed bid auctions where we can keep the amount of bidders and their prices confidential. And over the years, I used to call a lot of auctions, but then I realized that there's more to auctions than just standing up there calling. And candidly, I'm not really the best bid caller.
Would you hire someone for that?
Anyway, so often we would hire someone because really what was going on is we were talking to the seller and talking to the bidders. And you can't talk to the sellers and talk to the bidders while you're standing at a podium calling an auction. So it was having a really good bid caller and good ring people at a live auction. Those are the people that go around the audience and assist the bidders, because a lot of bidders are squeamish in a room filled with strangers to say $500,000. Not everybody's that bold. People would rather whisper to the person that works for the auction company, I'll bid 500, and they scream out the 500 for the person.
Interesting.
So yeah, it was always it was kind of a show, but it was a serious business too. And often the seller needed to be counseled while the auction was going on as to what was happening and decide if this was the right time. Very often at live auctions, the bidding would start out with reserve, and when we hit a certain point, the seller would say, you can now lift the reserve. And from that point on, it turned into an absolute auction.
And do they call in at that point, or like they signal to you? How do they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, if they weren't there, they would be on the phone.
Yeah.
Or if they were there, they'd say, "Go ahead, you can."
I've seen that happen. When they get the call and they're like, "Okay."
And
now.
we did that, for much of the 1990s. We did here in Chicagoland builder closeout auctions, the last 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 homes, townhomes, or condos, and very often builders would offer a few absolute, but the majority with reserve. And if enough
Maybe
people,
the least desirable unit is the absolute one.
no, that's what people perceive. No, usually we'd put them all in a pool, and we'd let the buyers decide which ones were absolute, which was interesting because it really found the purest way to. It was a good method. It got everybody
That
bidding.
cuts right through the fat.
It does, exactly. Smart.
Yeah.
It does. It takes a while to compute, but you got it pretty fast. But then after 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 have sold, the seller maybe wasn't obligated to sell any more absolute, but the seller wanted to keep selling absolute if they could deal with the prices. So round by round, if the prices got back up to another acceptable level based on the inventory that was still available for sale, they would say to me, "Rick, okay, announce that this round is absolute." And we'd sell the 6th one absolute. And then we'd start the 7th round. We'd start it with reserve. And if we hit an acceptable price, the seller would say, "Okay, Rick, Ron, whatever your name is, lift the reserve, sell this one absolute." And we would go. And sometimes we'd sell all 20 properties that way, where the seller would keep selling as long as prices got to acceptable levels. But as soon as prices dipped to unacceptable levels, if they were so inclined, they could stop selling the remaining units. Because they weren't looking, the seller wasn't looking to give them away. They were looking to sell them at, they were willing to give buyers good values, but they wanted to make sure they were finding them reasonable prices. And that's what that allowed them to do. And I think we might again see developer closeout auctions if there becomes an oversupply of new inventory and there's some kind of disruption, economic disruption, real estate disruption, where builders find themselves with a number of units and they want to sell them in a timely fashion. Because it works great. And sometimes all the stars line up and the sellers even get higher prices than they hoped for.
Than they would have otherwise.
Yeah.
You mentioned sealed bids. Why do people do sealed bids?
It could be a lot of different reasons, but often just by their very nature, you can keep the amount of bids and their prices confidential.
But why would you want to do that?
I think probably the biggest reason for a seller is if nobody bids, nobody has to know. And if 3 people bid, and one person says 1 million, the other says 2 million, the other says 3 million, you can take the $3 million bid without confrontation. Had that been an open auction, the bidding would have stopped at around $2 million in my example. So it goes to the thought that some pieces of real estate are just really hard to know what they're worth. And so you might want to set up a scenario where the buyers can bid their best, knowing that there's no tomorrow.
I feel like that scenario really makes someone sharpen their pencil.
It does. But that's what you want people to do.
Yeah.
That's what you want
It
people to
really
do.
pushes it to the
Right,
highest amount
right,
possible.
Right, but that's what you want people to do. There are other hybrid auctions where you start a first round of bidding as a sealed bid auction, and let's say there's 8 bidders, you take the top 3 and you have them do a second round of bidding a couple days later in an open format. And the bidding starts at the highest bid that the 3 offered, knowing that worst case scenario, the seller will get at least the highest sealed bid. That might be another type of auction that some sellers in certain situations might want to see done. But it all depends on the asset, it all depends on the seller. All depends on the situation. The idea is buyer and seller aren't upset. Everybody knows that this was arm's length, there was transparency, honesty, fair dealing, and all the rest involved. And it happened in a timely manner, because that's what's really lacking in a lot of asset sales. Like you said before, when I hear about a property that's been for sale for a year or 2 or 3 or 4, I wonder why.
Yeah.
What's going on? Who's not being reasonable here?
Yeah.
The seller or the buyer?
It's usually the seller.
Okay.
In my experience, it's usually the seller. When you see a property that's had 2 or 3 brokers,
Well, it could be the broker.
Yeah.
Because it could be a situation where the property's not being properly marketed.
But when it's 2 or 3 brokers, then you know it's a seller.
I'll say that.
Okay.
You don't have to say that.
No, I mean, that would seem to be logical.
Yeah.
Especially if they are companies that are known for good marketing, not just a one-off broker. It would seem if several large brokers in a row. But you know, a lot of sellers psychologically need to feel that whatever they sell the property for, it's what the market will pay. And so I would think for those sellers, an auction would be attractive, a well-publicized auction. Because then the sellers with their own eyes, it's not the broker telling them what it's worth, it's the market.
They know exactly what happened.
Right.
Thank you again for doing this.
Thank you.
Great, we
Appreciate
trying to put it together.
Yep. Thanks.